As drummers, we've all been there. We're listening along to a record and we kind of hear this magical musical moment where an incredible drummer finds the perfect snare sound for the song. Maybe it's Steve Jordan's snare on Vultures. Maybe it's Aaron Sterling's snare on Taste by Sabrina Carpenter. Maybe it's the buzz roll that Art Blakey plays on Moanin'. Maybe it's Matt Chamberlain's snare on One Headlight. Or for some of you peculiar people out there, maybe it's Lars on Saint Anger. Whatever the song is for you, we hear that sound and we're compelled to go on this quest to find out what snare drum they use to get that sound. So today I want to talk about snare drums, and I also want to dispel what I consider to be the biggest myth surrounding what snare drum to use to get that perfect sound. A lot of times when you start chasing that snare sound, you'll end up on some Reddit thread or a YouTube video in the comments section, and you'll find people arguing about shell composition, which brand it was, the exact year, was it MIJ or was it before they moved the production and all this stuff. To be honest, as a professional drummer that tours all over the world playing with artists and record drums in this studio for artists all over the world just about every day, I think that there are just a few basic principles we're going to talk about today that if you follow those, if you work on expanding your knowledge of those, they'll be a lot more helpful than kind of this mythological quest of searching through old photos from the studio session where that song was recorded and, digging through all these forums and going down this rabbit hole that just usually ends up with you at the end of it thinking you need to buy a very, very specific particular drum. So let's talk about 5 key aspects that I consider when I'm looking for a snare drum that should help you pick the right snare drum for whatever sound you're going for. Aspect number 1 is tunability. That's right. Number 1 is not the shell composition or the size or anything that a lot of people end up talking about, but it's tunability, because honestly for me, a drum is only as useful as it is tunable. For me, there are certain drums that you can kind of throw everything at and you tune them and they're easy to tune and they kind of just sound good tuned however. And then there are other drums that don't do that, and they're kind of way more specific in how they sound good, and they're kind of finicky and hard to tune. And typically, how tunable a drum is kind of a direct reflection of its build quality. The drum is built well, meaning, it has clean bearing edges, the shell composition is well put together, it's cut and sized in a way where heads fit on it nicely, and all of those things. If it is built well, it usually will be easy to tune. And yes, build quality usually reflects, the price of a drum. Usually, when drums cost more, they're easier to tune because the details have been paid attention to more. It has a higher build quality. But that's not even always the case. Sometimes you find a steal of a drum that's really inexpensive, but it sounds great and is really easy to tune. And you also get the opposite. Sometimes you spend a bunch of money on a drum that is just really hard to tune, and it's not always a reflection of the price. It really is just about how is the drum built. In my studio, some of the drums that I record the most, I spent $100 on them, or sometimes even less. And they sound amazing on the things that I record them on. But that's because I have the benefit of being able to mess with them a long time and get them dialed in to the perfect right tuning range for that drum and how it wants to be tuned with just the right amount of dampening, and I can leave it there in that sweet spot forever. But drums that are really well built and can kind of just, you throw any tuning at them and they do it well, you throw any dampening at them and it does it well, those are usually drums that are just more well built and they're going to be easier to tune. And again, if you're going for a particular sound from some record that you heard and you were inspired by it, make sure you have a drum that is very tunable and is easy to tune. If not, you're working against yourself. So before I go any further, in a ton of the clips that you're hearing in this video, you are seeing this drum that I have in front of me, which is a Sonar SQ1, which was provided by the sponsor of today's episode, Sweetwater. And this drum is kind of the perfect example of a tunable drum. You'll see it demoed throughout this whole video, but whether it's the beautiful visual of the matte lacquer cruiser blue finish, the 100% European birch shells, perfectly accurate shell sizing, the beautiful low contact 45-degree bearing edges. Tuning this thing is a breeze because they paid attention to every aspect. I'll put a link to this drum in the description of today's video so that you can check out this drum for yourself over on Sweetwater, because I think if you're looking for an all-around just kind of workhorse snare drum that you can throw anything at, this drum is definitely a great option. Check out any of those links in the description for this drum or anything else I have down there. I get a small kickback and you help support this channel when you use those links at no extra cost to you. So thank you again to Sweetwater for sending me this drum and sponsoring today's video. So let's get on to tip number 2 for selecting the right snare drum for whatever sound you're going for. Aspect number 2 I look at when I'm trying to find the right snare drum for something is reliability. And this has to do with how it will hold up to the elements of whatever I'm about to put it through. Personally, I find it really frustrating where you have a snare drum that maybe sounds really great one day, but then you kind of sit down at your kit the next day, or you pull it out of the trailer at the next gig and you hit it and you go, whoa, what happened? That's reliability. Now in this studio, I have some wonderful vintage drums that I love and they're beautiful, but they're not the most reliable. I found that touring with them is sometimes a pain because of the old hardware they have, and sometimes from day to day because of, humidity changes here in the South in Nashville or whatever else. It's just harder to get them to sound good every single time I sit down and play them, even though I've changed nothing about them. Reliability is important because it will help you get the same result every time you sit down at the drum. And again, you're not working against yourself. Sometimes if you use a drum that isn't all that reliable, you'll sit down, you'll get it tuned, you'll be like, yeah, that's the sound that Steve Jordan had on that thing. And then the next day you sit down, you go, maybe it wasn't. Maybe I was crazy. And sometimes it's actually the drum working against you. Now the Sonar SQ1 in front of me is actually a great example of a very, very reliable drum. And this is not the only one I have in the studio, but it's the one sitting in front of me and it's the one Sweetwater sent. So it's a very reliable drum because it takes into consideration some key areas that I find, drums that aren't as reliable don't necessarily think of as closely. So things like snare strainers is a detail that not everybody pays attention to. And sometimes when you're going for a certain tuning, especially like the low gushy snare thing, sometimes it's the difference between a tiny, like 1/6 of a turn tighter or looser is the make or break spot for it. And with certain snare strainers, I find it really, really hard to dial that in. It's kind of a pain. It makes it less reliable, less repeatable for me, because sometimes on some days I feel like it's nailing it. And sometimes I'm like, it's either too loose or too tight and I can't get it right. This Sonar SQ1 has a beautiful dual glide system that I've really enjoyed. It's probably the most robust and insanely engineered snare strainer I have, but it's amazing. And you can really dial in whatever snare strainer tension you want. Drum lugs are something that we don't always think about because they're on every drum and we kind of just, as long as the lug can turn, we're good to go. But certain drums I found are less reliable because they get detuned really quickly. You might do one take of a song, or you might play 3 songs during a gig, and by that 3rd song or that 2nd take, you're kind of hitting it going, man, the snare drum doesn't sound like it did a second ago. It's because one of those lugs has detuned. This SQ1 has tune-safe lugs, which I think is really cool, and I found in the studio here that it's been nice to be able to tune this drum to a range and not have it kind of dip tunings on me 1 or 2 takes into a song. So that's really great. So those are just a few things that I think impact the reliability of a drum. And that's really important. Again, you don't want your drum working against you when you're trying to achieve whatever sound that you're emulating from these records you love. Aspect number 3 that I take into consideration is size. Now, size is typically one of the first things that people think of when it comes to selecting the right drum. And a lot of people have this misconception that if the drum is small, then it excels at high tunings. If the drum is big, then it should be good at low tunings. And this is typically kind of true. Like smaller drums will excel and kind of have a sweet spot at higher tunings, and bigger drums will have a sweet spot and excel at lower tunings. But that's not always the case. The 2 dimensions of a drum that you have to take into consideration are the width, kind of the size of the head, and then the depth, kind of how deep the shell is. And in general, a lot of snare drums, their width will be anywhere from, 14 is the most common, but anywhere from like 12 to 14 is generally snare drums that you'll see out there. And then for depth, 5, 5.5, 6.5, all of these depths are kind of, the typical snare drum depths. But you can find drums that are as wide and deep as you want. And while it's true that the size does affect the snare's typical sweet spot, I have certain drums that are, 5 by 14 that sound amazing at low tunings, at like gushy tunings, which kind of flies in the direct opposition of this whole like bigger drums, like lower tunings. 5 by 14 is not a very big drum. And on the flip side, this Sonar SQ1 is a 6.5 by 14. That's a pretty big snare drum, a pretty deep snare drum that I think sounds incredible at higher tunings, because not only does it sound good at that high tuning, I think a lot of drums, especially smaller drums, when you tune them up really high, they might have this nice crack and pop, but they don't really have this low end that kind of like brings the drum into your face and makes you, feel beefy. This drum, when you tune it up high, not only has that crack and that pop, but it also has a nice low end fundamental, which makes the drum feel really, really solid. I would say the size of the snare drum usually gets you in the ballpark, but it's nothing that you should kind of hang your hat and know for sure about. You always kind of have to test it out with certain drums and kind of experiment. Aspect number 4 I think about when choosing the right snare drum for something is the shell material and the construction. And again, this is one of the first topics that a lot of people jump to. And while shell material and construction does have, some amount of influence on how the drum likes to be tuned and what it's going to excel at, I find this category maybe the most elusive and kind of misleading. So some different shell materials that you might find, you have your metal drums and you have your wooden drums. For metal, you have things like brass and steel and aluminum and copper and bronze. And naturally, maybe those metal drums have a little bit more kind of clang to them, a little more ring to them. And then you have your wood drums like maple and birch, like this SQ1, mahogany, poplar, and naturally, maybe these wooden drums, they're a little more dry and controlled. But I've played metal drums that sound super controlled without any dampening, and I've played wooden drums that are super clangy no matter what you do. So yeah, there are some general things about metal and wood that maybe you can take into account, but I would say always verify with that particular drum, because sometimes, again, they can be totally opposite of what you assumed they would be. So take it with a grain of salt. Otherwise, again, you're gonna be working against yourself, because I think sometimes shell material can be a total red herring. Aspect number 5 of what I look for in snare drums to go and get the perfect snare drum sound for whatever I'm after is head selection and dampening. And I actually have an entire video where I talk about the importance of drum dampening. I'll link that below in the description. So I'm not gonna belabor this, but when it comes to drums, especially snare drums, I find that the heads that you have on it and the way that you dampen that drum can wildly revolutionize the sound you're getting from that snare drum. Like I'm talking, sometimes it can be 80% of the snare sound. The reality is a lot of people view dampening as this evil thing you're not supposed to do. If you have a good drum and you know how to tune it, you don't need dampening. And that's just not true. There are certain drum sounds that can only be achieved using dampening.
When waters divide under the light of polarity.
So dampening isn't always a sign of someone not knowing how to tune a drum. It can sometimes be they're going for a specific sound and it needs dampening to achieve that. So for me, I think the biggest myth surrounding snare drums is that you need a particular drum to get a particular sound. I just don't think that's true. I think if you take these 5 things we talked about today into consideration, you can find the right drum that's gonna get you exactly to the sound that you're looking for. Now, do you have stuff that you consider when you're looking for a snare drum? Go ahead, drop those in the comments. Or if you have questions, put those in the comments. If you like this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you really enjoyed it, because I come out with videos like this all the time. And that's it for this one. Thanks again to Sweetwater for sponsoring this episode. Links for a ton of stuff that I talked about are in the description. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.